it's just worth noting that we've reached a point now where basically organic entry into the property market is becoming an endangered species in terms of new entrants. Like you've got, on one hand, you've got the government. Housing Australia talked up a report a while back where basically they said up to 40% of new market entrants received some form of federal assistance to get into the market. Now, with Albo's scheme, I suspect that that particular proportion is going to get even higher. And then, as you've covered, for many years now with your data, you've got up to. I mean, well, what was the peak in your data for the number of people receiving assistance from the Bank of Mum and Dad?
Well, it's well north of 50%, in some cases, closer to 60%, depending on definition of support. And the average amount is rising. It's well over the 120, 130,000 now. And in Sydney, it's even higher because, of course, prices are higher. So you're right. There's a smaller, shrinking proportion of people who can find their own way into the housing market unless they've got support from either the government and or the Bank of Mum. And by the way, I'd make the point that in my surveys, there are people waiting for 1 October to come to be able to go get that property and also use the Bank of Mum and Dad as well, and use some of the state supports as well. So when you actually pile all of these elements up, you realize that there are people out there saying, okay, I'm going to buy because, I've got all of these handouts from these various sources. Great for those who can. But bear in mind, of course, also the Productivity Commission always says, well, remember, this is a mechanism to help the sellers of property rather than the buyers of property. It's not going to solve housing affordability because the people who can't get into the market still can't get into the market. It mostly impacts those who would have already been able to get into the market at some point, bring it forward slightly. So it doesn't really solve fundamental housing affordability, but it does solve the government's problem of trying to create more momentum in the economy, stamp duty, and also the wealth effect, property prices going up, which is the only game in town. So you can see directly through this why they're doing it and the implications, but it's not actually going to solve the housing affordability problem. It's just going to stoke the prices higher. And it's interesting to note the latest ABS data for the last quarterly lending statistics. They do it quarterly now, unfortunately. The average across Australia, the average first-time buyer loan is now $550,000, and that's the highest it's ever been. It's tracking quite a lot higher. And of course, it's a lot higher in Sydney relative to some other places. So it's a mess. But the government is putting all of its eggs in the property basket again.
Yeah, I was just wondering, have you sort of done like research over time as to what proportion of first home buyers are receiving both assistance from their parents or from family and some form of assistance from the federal government? Is that a data set that you have, or?
The answer is yes. And about 2/3 of those who get the first time buyer grant is getting some other form of help as well.
Wow, you'll have to send that to me. I would love to get into detail on that.
I'll look that data out, and it's been growing. So if you go back, there was a big peak through the COVID period with Home Builder and all that sort of stuff. But if you go back into the previous generation, it tended to be either or. You got a bit of help from Bank of Mum and Dad, or you got help from. But now everybody grabs whatever there's well, because of course the states say, well, help yourself, and then the government's saying, well, help yourself. First time buyer, yeah, welcome, come all. And 5%. Just remember, folks, 5% is not a very big buffer. And if prices did wobble or go down at some point, and there's still a risk of that, then there's a bit of a negative equity problem. But of course, the negative equity problem initially is going to be held by the government, i.e., we the taxpayer. So we the taxpayer are effectively helping to prop up the property market. Don't you feel good about that, Tarek?
Well, I think it's kind of strange actually, because I've always thought, sort of do the right thing, build a deposit, have a buffer. But it turns out that despite my best efforts and the best efforts of lots of people who are aspiring home buyers, we could end up in a situation where the government makes such a mess of things we're actually paying for being in negative equity without ever actually having a mortgage.